shelters. So as a starter, let's review the strategic priorities for City Council. You can see it's about creating a 20-minute city where residents can walk, bicycle, or use public transit, and also to achieve very satisfied or satisfied on measurements in the Tempe Transit Survey. Our purpose and goals in this portion of our public meetings is to create a consolidated option, integrating all the best features in the comments that we received from the public, from staff, and from our committees and boards. So we're looking at several important issues. The form and function, of course, it has to be flexible. We want to be able to scale it to the different sizes to fit different specific sites, and simplicity in terms of being able to put it together, take it apart, move it. We're also looking in this format for something that will have a long life and be reusable, be able to be refreshed and used again out in the field. The comfort and accessibility, of course, includes shade, trying to cool the environment, and having sufficient seating. Aesthetics of how we light it, what colors we're using, textures, trying to make it a pleasing environment. And we're going to talk a bit about materials research that we've done, some data collection that we'll be doing through the course of next year. And finally, focus on sustainability. And what this means is we're selecting materials that either have recycled content, can be recycled after life, is renewable material. We want to look and be sure we're working with the city's shade goals, increasing transit ridership, and looking at life cycle costs. So as we went out, even from the very beginning in our very earliest comments, key was shade, maximize shade. This comes across, it seems, no matter what venue we're in. So of course, that's a high priority. Again, keeping a sustainability focus. We're looking to have our new shelters be unique to Tempe, so it becomes something of an icon and an image for our city. Most important, again, is that our riders feel safe and comfortable in our shelters. We are providing all ADA accessibility, meeting all the requirements, and then going beyond in many cases. And we want to help keep the environment cool so that we draw more ridership because they're not hesitant to go wait at the bus stop. We've done quite a bit of outreach already on this process. We began in August of last year. We held, including this meeting, a total of 5 public meetings, 2 in September, January, and of course, this meeting in July. You can see that we had almost 300 survey responses from the first 2 groups of meetings. So we're looking forward to getting some robust feedback online from this meeting as well. We've had 4 steering committee meetings. You can see the list of board, commission, and special interest meetings that we've done, which included reaching out to Valley Metro Accessibility Advisory Group to get their input, as well as the residents at Broadway Apartments. And then Laura and her staff did some transit ridership pop-up surveys at bus stops. Here's the variety of communication tools we've used. If you're familiar with our city processes, this is typical of how we outreach, and we hope to attract a lot of interest in having citizens participate in our meetings. So from community survey results to date, here's a ranking, and I just want to really emphasize that the idea of shade, appropriate and sufficient seating, and lighting were really far above everything else on our surveys. So we've made sure to listen and review all the comments and integrate that within our designs that you'll see today. So first I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about where we started. We had originally presented, well, we started with somewhere between 9 and 13 ideas and did quick sketches. We took some of the early ones out, and we asked the public and other participants, how do we narrow this down to get the best shelter? We came up with 3 concept explorations. This was and what was unique about it was having the green planter, having some landscape and greenery to, again, provide a shade screen that would also be cooling. Each of these explorations also have a little bit different type of design. The second one is the one we're going to be talking more about today, and that's Concept B. So I won't talk much about it here. And Concept C was also looking at how we could create a minimalist shelter that would be adaptable. It could be reproduced in various modules, so it would be very easy to expand if we needed to. So after we took comments from all of those responding, I had our consultants evaluate all those comments by this design criteria that you see listed here. Shade, how the public was accepting of the idea, safety, sustainability, flexibility, maintainability, something of a unique design, and cost. Although I will say right now, while cost is a very important element as we go through with developing our design, at this early stage, we were looking more conceptually and not doing cost estimates. From their tally, we came up with the Scheme B as being the most appropriate. So what we did then is not just automatically eliminate everything else, but we took the good ideas from Concept A and Concept C and put it all into a new model. And so that's what we're going to be talking more about as we go forward. And I do want to introduce, I know that Laura introduced you to James Bard. James, why don't you go ahead and speak a little bit as we go forward? The two of us will talk a little more about these shelters. And we'll note for you as well, this is what's considered a medium-sized transit shelter, something like our regular shelter today, only this is 7 feet by 14 feet in terms of its footprint, but the roof canopy is almost 10 feet by 25 feet. So you'll see in all of these that what we tried to do was expand the roof so that we could be sure and provide as much shade as possible. Go ahead, James. Why don't you talk a little bit about this? And let me know when you want to move to the next slide. Can't hear you.
He's not on mute. James.
I apologize for that.
Yeah.
So, and I was saying, Bonnie, so I'm going to actually pull in Adam to do a chunk of these slides as kind of the primary generator of the concepts, but I do want to reiterate something you just said about that public feedback that has come in relation to the 3 early alternatives. We've really focused on what was liked and what was not as favorably received of each of those 3 elements and tried to incorporate that into a moving forward concept. So we very purposely did not want to just dismiss what was included and received very favorably amongst the other alternatives, and hopefully those have followed the project and kind of been involved. We'll see that some of those elements have been incorporated to really optimize and put forward what we think is the best overall concept. So yeah, like I said, I'd like Adam Hawkins, and he's been a big part of our design team to date, to really walk through the details on these with the group, if that works for everyone.
That's terrific. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Bonnie. Thank you, James. Yeah, as Bonnie mentioned, you know, the thought process moving forward with the previous comments as we related it to this consolidated concept is again taking the elements that worked the best or were most favorably viewed in A and C and kind of combining those into the concept you see. Again, having an idea of how do we provide shade as much as possible throughout the day, again, depending on what orientation this transit shelter ends up getting placed at. So again, looking at, you know, the deep overhangs allow you to provide shade, as well as the interior portion of the bus stop itself. Again, you have options to sit inside of it, outside of it, on the ends. Again, multiple options as far as seating, either, you know, fold down seating, bench seating from a standard site furnishing point of view, or a built-in seating. Again, keeping in mind how does this get maintained, how are things replaced, how do things function, and just thinking about all these things long term. How do we best you know, fulfill those needs from the city standpoint, as well as keeping in mind how we keep everyone safe as far as ridership is concerned. So again, thinking long term about how we view these transit shelters. You see on the right hand side there, the thought being is that some of these shelters could be you know, lit up with a signage panel, or maybe they're colored for different neighborhoods, or again, just how do we incorporate that different little piece aesthetically, where it's part of the whole package, but again, it kind of stands alone as an item if we're trying to place it in a certain neighborhood or a certain district within Tempe. So, but essentially, that is this consolidated concept.
And I'd like to make a few other observations for you. We are providing side screening to help create more shade in the Arizona desert, with our shelters on either east-west or north-south streets. There's always some time of day, unfortunately sometimes it's during the commute time, that an overhead canopy just will not shade you while you're waiting for the bus. So that's why it's important for us to create some side screens that create different pools of shade while you're waiting. Sometimes you might have to walk outside of the shelter, behind the shelter, but we're trying to make sure that you can escape from the direct sun through most of the day. It's also important that we maintain visibility. That's both for the rider who is waiting for the bus to be able to see the bus, and for the bus driver to be able to see riders who are transit riders who are waiting for the bus. So we try as best possible to indicate this as screens, but once we get into actually prototyping this, you'll be able to see more clearly what the different materials are that we'll be using, and we have a few different options as we proceed. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. Okay, Adam, you want to talk about the different sizes?
Yes, thank you. The previous slide was, again, as Bonnie mentioned, the medium version. In addition to that, we also looked at 3 other sizes: the micro, the small, and the large. The top 2 being the ones that were probably the most likely to be installed, because due to the limited amount of right-of-way throughout the city of Tempe, again, we're trying to maximize the verticality of like a side panel or a vertical panel, again, to help provide as much shade as possible, depending on orientation. At the same time, expanding out that roof line to, again, as much as possible to provide shade. We knew shade is absolutely the most important element, as Bonnie mentioned. So, and as space provides, maybe the micro, we can go into the small size and expand that footprint and that canopy. And then as maybe at certain key locations, we have enough space where we can do a large, which is essentially just a pulled apart version of the medium version, again, creating quite a large roof canopy and a significant amount of seating space inside. So you're not only protected with an overhead canopy, but as well as Bonnie was discussing previously, the side screen panels that will help with late or early sun.
And again, I want to emphasize the differences in sizes and as it relates to what we currently have. These two smaller ones really are very shallow. So the micro is only 3 feet deep, and it can be extended to 9 feet wide. What we found in looking at, we have over 800 bus stops, and we've got about 38% coverage now. Almost all the stops that remain without shelters, it's due to some type of site restriction. Typically, it's because we don't have it. Where we do have right away, it's very narrow. So you can see that medium size, which is similar to what we've been putting out, is 7 feet deep. So the micro being only 3 feet deep and the small one being only 5 foot deep, those can fit, I would say, on probably 90% of the remaining sites where we would like to provide shade for our ridership. And that's a big change for us. Another advantage to that is also that smaller scale can help us manage costs. We put the large footprint where we've got maximum ridership, and those typically occur where we've got multiple bus routes, where we have people crossing and making changes from one route to the next. For instance, McClintock and Southern, or Rural and Southern, some of the other major intersections. So that's where you would find the larger versions. So here is a closer view of the micro. Adam, you want to talk about anything else about materials, or maybe the seating?
Yeah, and here in these two options for the micro, you have on the left a custom-made panel reminiscent of the City Hall building with just a varying of shapes of a triangle. And then on the right-hand side is a louvered panel, again, maybe powder-coated aluminum or something similar to that nature, as well as seating options, again, whether that is called an off-the-shelf bench with armrests or something that's more integral to the transit shelter where the seat is actually built into the stop itself. So, and again, you can see on the one on the right, again, thinking about how we want to label or call out these stops if that moves forward, just where that would go and how they would be placed within the structure.
Okay.
And the same kind of emphasis is placed on the small as well. Just, again, how do we coordinate the materials throughout all of the 4 sizes and make it a cohesive design. On this one, we were able to integrate seating not only on the interior, but also the exterior as well. Again, whether that be fold-down seating and off-the-shelf benches or something that's more integral. Again, thinking long-term about materiality, you know, we really wanted something that was very environmentally friendly and recyclable. We looked at different materials, you know, recycled plastic. I think long-term and through discussions with other vendors and fabricators, the most ideal solution is like a perforated steel or something that's not quite as dense as just plain sheet steel. So looking at how we can make seats that are easy to maintain and have a long life cycle, but at the same time are comfortable to sit on.
Right, and I think also in looking back at all of our comments, some people said, well, you shouldn't sit outside of the shelter, but the shelter is not exactly a room. It's a structure for shade, and so sometimes the shade's on one side of the screen, sometimes it's on the other. By providing flexibility this way, the person waiting can choose to move around and find a place that is shaded. Also, by keeping the seats up off the floor, it makes it much easier for our maintenance people to be able to power wash and not be damaging any of the structure down in the ground. A lot easier to clean and maintain.
And this is a version of the large transit shelter. Again, as Bonnie mentioned, maybe these will be placed at locations where multiple bus routes converge in one location, or you have high ridership volumes where you would need additional space to accommodate those folks. So here again, looking at opportunities for integrated seating or off-the-shelf seating and foot-down seating, and again, what type of vertical elements do we put in those panels, whether it be a simple wire mesh, the custom shade panels or steel panels with the graphic imaging to it, or the louvers along the back panel there.
So I'll also mention at this time the opportunity for putting in public art. We do not have a budget for public art for these shelters, but as we're fabricating screens, we will be able to create a mechanism so that a piece of art could be inserted in a screen, or potentially the screen itself could be modified. So we want to find an easy way for people, and I don't know if these might be neighborhoods deciding that they're using their neighborhood grant to help provide artwork for their neighborhood shelters, whether we can obtain some other grants to provide art with the shelters. But right now, we do not have in the budget any funding for art. So we haven't forgotten about it. So as we move forward and this becomes more of a reality in placing the art, we will be providing information about how we would do that. This gives you, if you can, assume you're a bird flying over and you're looking down. This shows you how much seating is actually available in this large transit shelter. I think we are all, due to the pandemic, much more aware of our surroundings and about spacing and personal distance. And while hopefully that will not be part of our long-term future going forward, it does still give us pause to think about providing people with options about where they can locate themselves in relationship to others. These are some samples of color palettes, and we'll be showing you. What we did was we took the colors that are in the City of Tempe palette and are combining them with a light gray or a steel or a burnished finish, keeping them light, not having a lot of dark, heavy colors. All right, do one of you guys want to talk about this shading slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see, we did a real quick shade analysis based on June 20th from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. So as you go from left to right, you can see how the sun starts to move across the sky and how much shade is provided. Around noon to 1 p.m. up to 2 p.m. we're still pretty good. And then obviously with this being on the northeast corner facing west, we start to get that setting sun. So around 4 or 5 p.m. the shade would be on the backside of this shelter. So again, the opportunity being that maybe we have seating again on as many sizes as possible to provide that space for protection from the sun. And again, each kind of location, as we move forward in the concepts, thinking about how the panels get oriented and how dense those panels need to be to help protect as much as possible based on its orientation.
And as we look at these shelters, we think of them as being a kit of parts, because while you might see shade screens more prominently on the south side here, if we flip it around, it's on the other side of the street. we would change where those panels are. So we're always making sure the high visibility is toward where the bus would be coming from.
These are the lighting concepts. Again, just keeping in mind the safety of the riders and as well as approaching pedestrians walking past. We want to make sure that the interior portion of the transit shelter is well lit. And not only that, as far as safety lighting is concerned, we also want to bring in an aesthetic element. So if we move forward with coordinating the signage on the signs, again, maybe those are backlit with a single LED light source, and whether that's a cutout panel with acrylic, again, to be determined, but again, trying to think about how we can go one step beyond the basic safety lighting to make the shelter more inviting.
Never cross the line.
And our shelter lighting will be provided by solar panels mounted on the roof. Now, so this gives us some nighttime drama, but be assured that the area where people will be waiting and passengers sitting will be well lit so that people can always be seen easily for safety as well as for their comfort while they're at the shelter. This slide gives you an idea of some of the things we looked at in types of benches. When we look at the flip seat, it offers a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, they let me know.
Uh-oh, someone here maybe needs to be muted. Okay, so we're looking for ways that we can maximize seating, but also want to be sure that we have plenty of shade areas in seating, shade and accessibility should people be in wheelchairs. So those seats can flip up and provide more room for wheelchairs, or they can flip down when you have enough people that you need to supply more seating. Our trash containers, we're required to use clear bags and be able to have the bag visible as a safety measure. So that is the type of, this type of trash container would be used. And then, of course, the bike hoops. This shows you also some of the different finishes. The corrugated and perforated panels on the right, you can see that at the Daly Park shelters that are there, the picnic areas, as well as some of the aluminum louvers. And then here are the colors that are our Tempe brand colors. So we're working within any of these ranges, and we can look further down the line at seeing how, what people's preferences are and how we might want to use color, again, to give some Tempe identity to our shelters. Here again, just calling out the materials as we've been discussing.
You know, I know I said we would take all the questions at the very end, but this one seems to be kind of relevant right now, so I'll go ahead and read it.
Okay.
One of our attendees said that they like the look of the shelters, that they look great, but the question is, will every shelter also have a trash and bike rack? Those would be separate and not incorporated into the design?
Those will be selected as a part of the design, so they're coherent with it, but they will tend to be on the side closest to where you board the bus. So at the last minute, if you've got a soda can, you can toss it in the trash before you get on the bus. Also, that side is where the loop would be. In the event you can't get your bike on the front of the bus, you still have time to lock it up. So both of those elements are outside of the sitting area and closest to where the front of the bus would be, yes. And every stop would have those two elements. Okay. So when I mentioned sustainability, we've been doing quite a bit of research. We've looked at various types of mixes for the concrete to see if we could either contain carbon in the concrete mix, reduce the amount of material, therefore reducing the use of sand and gravel and things that make it heavier and holds more heat. Likewise, we've been looking at the roof. And David Saylor is the director of the Urban Climate Research Center at ASU and a professor there. And I would say there are about 7 or 8 professors from ASU who have worked with us closely at how we can make these shelters as sustainable as possible. So we are going to be testing the latest radiative film, which will be provided and installed by 3M companies. So this is a collaborative arrangement between 3M, ASU, and the city of Tempe. Additional professors, Medell and King, will also be working with David, and they applied for and received some internal ASU grant funding that allows us to do a full year testing of shelters between July of this year or August of this year and August of the following year. So what we're going to be doing, we've selected 6 existing bus shelters that are not shaded by buildings or trees. 3 will be kept as they are, and 3 will receive supplied film. And in these shelters, we'll be placing receivers to receive data about temperature, not only in terms of what the temperature of a material is or the air is, but also how temperature relates to the comfort of a person standing under or near the shelter. So this is a concept that can be a little hard to get your head around at first. But there are 2 different spectrums that work on our roofs, and one's the solar spectrum, which you see marked in yellow, that reflects sunlight, so that can help make a surface cooler. But this is also working within the atmospheric window of wavelengths. And when you have a material that can access that window, it sends the heat of the air and materials up into cold sky. And so that almost essentially pulls heat out of the area into the deep space of what they call cold sky. So these super cool materials really stay colder than their surroundings, even in direct sunlight. So it will also create, we hope, a coolness around the shelter. Now, this has been tested on a couple of buildings, or several buildings, that 3M has been working on this for some time. And they are saving substantial amounts of money for stores that do heavy refrigeration. And they've found significant savings on their cooling by using these materials on their roof. So this is the first time we're applying them, not to a closed-in building, but to a shelter. But we believe that this can help cool the air, and thanks to 3M and ASU, we're going to be able to test this out. If this works well, we will be able to apply this surface to the top of the new shelters. And in fact, the design anticipates applying this type of material. So you see a flat roof that doesn't have so many ribs, that makes it easier to apply the materials. The materials can have lasted, the early phase materials had a 10-year life. They are now developing this second type of material that will last for 20 years, and it's being tested in Arizona heat. So we're really on the cutting edge here of looking at materials that can substantially improve our sustainability in our transit shelters. David Saylor, are you on the line? I'm not sure if he was able to be on or not. He would be able to answer more questions, but I'm also happy to take your questions at the end and attempt to make a broader explanation if needed. So now we want to talk about prioritization, because if we have 400 plus sites without shelters, how do we decide where to start infilling? And typically, most cities in the past have actually just looked at ridership numbers. So if you have a high ridership now, you will receive a shelter. We looked at our historic placement of shelters in the same way. So you'll notice that everywhere we have a high ridership, we already have shelters in those locations. But now we're getting where people may just as well depend on the bus, but there may not be that big a population surrounding them. So how do we determine how to place these shelters? We know that we have a lot of households without vehicles, 9.4%. Many of those use transit as a means to work, and significantly, 81% of our property, which is an indicator for a need for alternative transportation. So these are just a few of the statistics we have now, and also to let you know that our ridership has been over 900 million per year. So on the right, you see a picture where you've got heat reflecting not just from the sidewalk and the dirt that's in the street, and also from masonry walls. So as we look at how we're placing shelters, we're also looking at walls surrounding or nearby the stop, as well as any other landscape, and we're taking this all into account. So what we want to do is identify these critical measures for shelter placement, and this is how we've identified them. We've got the initial average weekly boardings. We also can look at transit demand, both by population and by employment center. So that would be how many people are there to serve as residents or serve as employees in Tempe. And this time we are also adding an equity approach. So we're looking at minority populations, households below poverty, and heat vulnerability, because we know that heat really is substantially impacting our community. And if you aren't in an area where sidewalks are shaded by trees or buildings, in the summer it can be pretty brutal. So we want to try to make it as comfortable as possible. This is just one example of a map that we're using for looking at these issues. So we're doing transit shelter maps where we identify the red and blue dots show blue is we've got a shelter, red we do not have a shelter. Then the trees, those green dots are trees we have in our city landscape or on our city properties. So if we know we need to put a bus stop where we have city right-of-way that has landscape and water, we may have a better opportunity to use trees to shade and cool that area if we can't get out there and immediately put a shelter in place. But what I'd like you to look at here is this pink to red color. And this is prepared by it's the National Urban Heat Island map for 2018 and 2019 summer times. And the darker the color, the more heat you're getting in an area. And of course you can see where we've got a lot of trees in the center of Tempe, you're not getting any of that color. So this is one map prepared that lets us know there are some areas of our city that are just hotter than others. Here's another type of map we're looking at, and this one identifies heat illness, and it's by hospital visits per 100,000. So the darker the color again, the more we've found. And this map was one of the first, so it's 2014 to 2018. And as maps, of course, we're getting more and better information, we'll have updated maps to use. So we would think that if these are heat vulnerable areas, and people need to ride the bus, we would want to look at that as prioritizing places where we would go first to provide new shelters. So we have a process. Thus far, we've been doing conceptual designs. Now we're going to be moving in to the engineering design aspect. We will have reviews at 30% design, 60%, and 90%, which is typical. And during those reviews, what we're looking at is constructability. Do we have that kit of parts? Does it work? Do we need to modify it to make it better? Does the connection need to be changed to make it easier for our staff to put them together and take them apart? And also, are they adaptable to the various site constraints that I mentioned earlier? At each stage, we'll be doing cost estimates and what we call value engineering, so that we'll be asking ourselves, is there a better way we can provide this, getting more quality for less cost? And finally, we'll be really testing out materials, finishes, and getting samples of the colors so we can actually see what it might look like. During design, we'll also be working with a fabricator who is going to develop a prototype at the end of 90% design, and that will be available for public review and comment. With regards to funding, our goal is to meet the needs of more transit riders, to actually attract more ridership by serving the restrictive sites that weren't able to handle shelters before, and potentially at lesser cost than full-sized shelters. As we know, prices go up on materials, so we want to be very aware in this budget cycle that we're in of how we can provide the best quality at a life cycle analysis that determines we're getting good value for what we're paying. The sources for funding are the Tempe Transit Tax, which provides for annual bus stop improvements, and then partnerships with private development in the community who may be responsible for paying for shelters on their properties as they develop them. Next steps after this meeting include a Transportation Commission meeting on August 18th, the Council issue review session on August 20th, to have the fabricated prototype for public review in spring 2021, and then initiate installations of suit as we've completed the final documents in early summer 2021. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and James or Adam or I can answer. We also have Eric Iverson online who can also address some questions as well. So I appreciate your attention and participating. Happy to hear your comments.
Okay, well, we have our first one from Kim. She's asking, are Orbit bus stops being considered for these shelters?
We do have some bus stops that also pick up Orbit riders, and those are considered. We've had a lot of interest for stops for Orbit. Since Orbit is primarily a flag type of service, we hadn't intended to place shelters there. But again, as we see how this fits and where we've got high ridership, we may be able to review that and see what we can do.
Okay, we have another one. Does comfort of benches include concern with heat? Metal is very hot to sit on.
Well, if I could tell you the hours we've spent talking about bench materials. We started with, we had some concrete, and people did not like concrete for benches. This metal will be covered with a coating that helps to keep them cool. Again, anything in the full direct late sun of summer is going to warm up. but we are designing them so that they breathe. There are holes in it. It's a mesh type surface that enables airflow. And we're trying to select absolutely the best seating possible, taking into account that it needs to be extremely durable, that people we don't want skateboarders running along the edge. We want to be able to have armchairs for those who may need assistance getting up and down. Right now, it is looking, we looked at plasticized materials and recycled plastics. It appears that those are in use in some places, but they don't seem to have the life cycle value that using metal does. So currently, we're looking at the metal benches. I will say that research is changing all the time, and there's even the potential that if this roof surface works well, to actually run a line through a bench, and it could cool water that would cool a dense material like concrete and actually provide a cool seat or more cooling in the area. But we're starting very slowly with some of these new ideas to test, and maybe in the near future we'll be able to test some type of bench that might provide more cool.
Yeah, Bonnie, before we go to the next one, I would just add to that, we also kind of looked a little bit at pressurized timber. You know, we got that request during some of the comments. Unfortunately, just for our climate, those don't seem to hold up per our research. And then in addition to our climate, the way these are going to be maintained is regular pressure washing, and that can over time also lead to degradation of certain type of materials. So some of that came into consideration of how we're at the metal options right now that will be powder coated, will have a film on them to keep them as cool as possible, but understood that the driving force is always to look for the most comfort possible on those.
More questions?
Right now, I am not seeing any. Anyone have, oh, I do see a person has their hand up. Where'd they go? David. David, you are unmuted.
Hi, this is Sokolowski, just so you know, not Sailor. I just wanted to clarify that I understood correctly. So the panels will be adjusted based on the location of the bus stop, but will the panels be uniform, or might we have like louvers and perforated at different locations at different sides, or are we going to decide on one basic panel?
That's a good question. As we've tried to note in these this modeling, we anticipate using maybe two types of screening so that panel might be toward the back wall, and the other more transparent screening might be used in other locations. So as we get to the place where we're testing materials, for the prototype, we will probably have 4 or 5 different types of screen materials that we can look at, and we may actually put those up out in the field and do some testing and see how they perform. So the goal is to have a couple, 2 or 3, maybe even 4 different kinds of screens that we can use at different stops. Yes.
Well, and then David, to add to that too, the what Bonnie mentioned earlier in the presentation, that's also our opportunity, and we want to maintain flexibility for the potential incorporation of public art. It was in place of some of those panels. So I think it's important to maintain a little bit of that flexibility as we get towards a final design here.
And just to add one more thing to that, you know, as we think about, you know, safety, that there's a fine line between the panel being too opaque versus translucent. At the same time, we don't want to lose too much that it's not creating any meaningful shade. So we're really trying to balance, you know, the need for as much shade as possible while keeping the overall shelter itself very highly visible. So again, I think that, as Bonnie mentioned, the multiple panels or their styles rather, and dependent upon where they are end up being located, is kind of going to be, I want to say, like a case-by-case basis almost. And when we start to develop the design further and start to prototype, we'll get a better sense of how dense we can make those panels be to maximize the shade while keeping them transparent enough to make it safe for everybody that's going to use them.
We have another question. Just disappeared. It was regarding COVID-19 and whether the impacts of COVID will have impacts on funding for this project.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Hang on. It's very hard once they are in here. It had to do with COVID-19 and whether funding for the bus shelter project will be impacted by COVID-19.
Eric, are you still with us? Do you want to discuss anything about funding? Personally, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Just really quick. This is Eric with City of Tempe. That's a great question. The short answer is, at this point, no. Our funding for our annual bus stop maintenance program is fully funded. We are watching very closely with what's happening with COVID and the economy. And we are reducing our transit fund budget carefully. And we are going to have a public process for that this fall to begin that discussion. But this is, we have 800 plus bus stops in the city. About 40% of those have shelters today. It's very important for us to continue maintaining all those existing shelters and to keep adding to those those locations where we don't have currently have shade. So it's important for us to keep that particular line item in our budget fully funded at this point.
We have another question. Kim has her hand up. Kim, you are unmuted if you'd like to go ahead.
Hi, guys. Well, thank you. This was a great presentation because a lot of my questions have been answered. But I do have one question about when you're talking about possibly coating that metal to reduce the heat element. Are you considering color on those seating elements as well?
We actually will have some options there about whether we could, yes, we could look at colors. We are attempting to develop a color scheme that's very flexible within the larger grouping. So if we're putting a couple hundred new shelters out, if we make too many colors of benches that fit different color schemes, then we end up having to carry a pretty large amount of equipment in case we have to replace it. So sometimes a more background or neutral color in the furnishings allows us, then we're just putting the color on the shelters. But that has not been fully decided yet. So if you have some comments about your preferences or what you're thinking, we're happy to hear that.
Well, I do think that a bit of color in there does make it pop, even if it's uniform. The picture that you showed at the bus stop with the walls and everything, that's an Orbit stop in our neighborhood that we were looking to get a bus stop at. But one of the things I did like about those was they had a bright bench. And so immediately people are drawn to it. And so I think even if it's a uniform color, that is used throughout the city, I do think having something that is a little more vibrant might be helpful.
Thank you. We will take note of that. You should have seen some of our early designs. We had some pretty vibrant orange going on and scared a few people, but I think we want to hear from you. And I do agree that the happy factor at creating a place that's pleasant and that can be done with color is an important consideration. So as we get further down the road, we'll be able to post some ideas on that. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I do hope that all of you will encourage your friends to take a look online. As Laura said, this will be posted, but also just the PowerPoint as well. The questionnaire will be online for 2 weeks. And again, we've had great response at the past 2 public meetings with people viewing online and sending us their comments. So please share what you saw and have people contact us. Laurie?
Yeah, I guess that's all we have. And just as a reminder, the comments and the questions that we have in the chat are not part of our official record. You'll need to go and make those at tempe.gov/transit shelters. So any suggestions, any reactions, any questions can be put there. And those will be part of the public record that goes to the Transportation Commission and the City Council. So unless there are any further questions, David, is your hand up from before, or do you still have a question? Okay, I see he put it down. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and tell your friends to go to the website, tempe.gov/transit shelters.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.